Saul's armor bearer, and one of the things that was said about him is that he was a man who was a man of valor, a man of war, skillful in playing, all of those kinds of things, which is a little confusing because up to that point we've not seen David do anything in war. He's not fighting like some of his brothers are. But really what's happening is it's chapter 17 that explains where David's military credentials come from through really a single event, as far as we know, that leads to him being the armor bearer for Saul. We've got things slightly out of order here because we have a summarizing statement in chapter 16 and then more of an explanation in chapter 17. Which I think we explained just fine last week. But this is the story of David and Goliath, of course one of the more familiar stories from the book of 1 Samuel, and it has a lot to teach us, but good for us to get this in the context of 1 Samuel. Sometimes we understand these stories isolated, but we don't see what they are in the whole context and chain of the entire book. So, at the beginning of chapter 17, we see the Philistines gathering their armies for battle. They are preparing to attack the Israelites, and this is one of those contextual notes that's useful for us. Because have the Israelites fought the Philistines before? Yes. Yes. And how did that go last time? They defeated them. They did defeat them. But what else happened? Yeah, so they weren't really able to finish the job in there. As Saul was kind of going back and forth, he was being wishy-washy, he was not sure whether he should be trusting in God or not sure whether they should be going into battle or not. Jonathan was more successful than Saul was, but the whole thing was kind of a blunder, even though it ended with them victorious. God was still with them, or maybe even more with Jonathan than he was with Saul, but Saul was a disaster in that whole thing. He made the rash vow. He was doing a lot of things that showed poor leadership, and even though they had the Philistines on their heels and had won this great victory, they were not able to go and to finish them off. And so the moment was lost, and now the Philistines will continue to be a problem for quite some time. This is one example of where they're going to be a problem. So the Philistines are coming up into battle, and there's a challenge that is made. So they're up on two different mountains. There's a valley in between. You've got one army on one side, one army on the other, but they've not rushed into battle against each other yet. They're going to fight down in the valley like they normally would. But instead, out of the camp of the Philistines, a champion named Goliath comes out. Now, we got a few things to say about Goliath, but first off, what is the challenge that is made? Yeah.
You send your champion out, I'll fight him. Whoever wins, wins.
Okay. So, single combat, champion versus champion. Why would they do something like this? I mean, it makes for a really great movie scene to have, the two main character and the villain fighting, have it all come down to that. Aaron?
Save lives.
Save lives, yeah. We get a little detached sometimes from the reality of these situations, but nobody is really thrilled about lots of people dying. Even in war, the respective sides don't want to see their, young males obliterated. That can have lingering effects on their whole society. Their families are destroyed. Even if you're victorious, if you've lost lots and lots of men, it leaves you in a very weak position. So yes, this kind of thing would happen sometimes, not just in the movies, but in real life that people would have this challenge of let's send our best soldiers, single combat, and winner take all. If your champion wins, then we will concede and we'll back off. You have defeated us. So that is what Goliath is challenging, and he is an imposing figure. He is a man very skilled in war. He is called a champion, and we have some interesting things said about him. One being his height. So we need to talk about Goliath's height for a moment, because there's a few interesting things about this. So in the version that I'm reading from, and I think most English versions, it says that his height was 6 cubits and a span, which would be 6.5 cubits, which would be 9 feet, 9 inches. That's a pretty tall man. And for this reason, a lot of times people talk about Goliath the giant, or David and the giant, things like that. The text never does call him a giant, though. And there are some other manuscripts that say that he was 4 cubits and a span, which would be 6 feet 9 inches, which is a pretty tall man even today, and was an exceptionally tall man back then. We believe that, you should know that throughout history, people have generally been getting taller as we're getting healthier, and kind of the way that genetics have worked over the years, over generations. Each generation is slowly getting taller than the last in general. And so back then, we believe that most males, adult males, would have been a little over 5 feet tall in those days. So significantly shorter than the average heights today. So a man who is 6'9" is going to be noticeably tall even for us today. That's the sort of person they walk through a door and go, "Whoa, you're tall." But back then, even more so, when the heights are smaller. So the manuscripts that I'm referring to, by the way, are also some very noteworthy manuscripts. So it's the original Hebrew text that says 6.5 cubits. And then it's the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls and Josephus and some others who say 4.5 cubits. So unfortunately, what we're left with there is two groups of very high quality, trustworthy manuscripts that differ on exactly how tall Goliath was. Yeah.
Well, whenever it talks about Goliath's brothers, it does refer to them as sons of the giant. In 2 Samuel chapter 31, verses 18 and verses 20, 23, stuff like that, it talks about they were sons of the giant.
Okay. Yeah, okay, interesting note there. So yeah, I'm referencing him being a giant there. So, okay, yeah. So good to know. So, yeah, okay, so thank you for that note. That's helpful. So, yeah, we're left with interesting questions as to exactly how tall he was. Basically, the two schools of thought are either the Hebrew text gave the real height, and then the later, Greek manuscript and Dead Sea Scrolls and such corrected it to something more believable, which might not even be accurate. Or the Hebrew text was something of an exaggeration because they did do histories a little bit different than we do and could have exaggerated numbers sometimes for the effect of it. And then the later texts are giving the correction to the real value. There is no definitive answer on whether it is 6.5 or 4.5 cubits. The effect here is that Goliath was an extremely tall man, and even more than his height is never the emphasis of this story. The emphasis is on the fact that he is a mighty champion. He is skilled in war. He is a physically imposing figure. And even his weapons are large and unwieldy, even larger than what a normal soldier is going to be using. So that's kind of the brief rundown on the height of Goliath. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or? Yeah.
If he was a giant, if he was a 9 foot 9 inches, those weapons that he used would be the size that somebody that size
Yeah.
would be using.
Yeah.
He would have bigger spear, bigger,
Sure.
bigger stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a terrifying figure. Yeah.
And also, if he was just a 6 foot or whatever, Saul might not have been as terrified of him, because Saul was a man of war, and Saul was head and shoulders above the other people.
Yeah.
So he would have been probably about the same, 6 foot something or whatever.
Yeah.
So he would have been about the same size if it was 6 foot.
Yeah, and I think that critique is there either way, because Saul's supposed to be the physically imposing figure of a champion for Israel. So whether he exactly matches up to Goliath's height or not, I don't think Saul was 9 feet tall. So if Goliath's 9 feet tall, then he definitely is taller than Saul. But even still, you don't have to be the same size to overcome him in combat. Saul is the one that the Israelites are in awe of. He is head and shoulders above the rest. He is a skilled man of war. He is the champion that they should be putting their faith in as far as they're concerned. Really, they should be putting their faith in God, but when they looked at Saul, what they believed was, this is the mighty man of valor whose job it is to rid us of the Philistines. And we do not see Saul going out into battle against Goliath. He makes no attempt to. He does not. We're not even given anything of him considering it or trying to decide whether he should or not. He simply does not go into battle against Goliath. And this is a lot different than what we see out of Saul in chapter 11, for example, when he is stirring everyone up, saying, God is with us. We need to fight against these heathens. This is the cause of the Lord, and we need to go out into battle against them. If you do not come, then I will cut your oxen into pieces, and I will burn your homes down, do all these things that he's saying. Saul had more faith back then. He's not showing, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but he's not showing any of that here because he's not going into battle. He is not making any moves to select a champion to go out into battle. He is just paralyzed in fear. The effect of Goliath is as intended by the Philistines. So whether he's 6'9" or 9'9", he has sufficiently terrified the people, and they are not eager to go into battle against him. John?
For me, I just think it's cool, maybe to compare biblical stuff to what we see nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, being a basketball fan, there's a handful of guys that are 7 foot, 7 plus. So I don't really find it hard to see that height in the Bible.
Yeah, I don't either, and I don't have a problem with the 9'9". The critique some people have against that is we don't know of any people that tall today. But the Bible does talk about giants in the land. Does talk about people, thinking of Nephilim in particular, and we don't know if Goliath would be related to the Nephilim or anything like that, but does talk about these particularly imposing people who were significantly taller than others. So we at least have some reference, some idea that this sort of thing could have existed. And that's fine. We don't have to know a 9 foot tall person today. It's possible that Goliath could have suffered from some kind of gigantism or some of the things we see today that do cause people to continue to grow and grow and grow without stopping. Those sorts of things do exist, and we have seen even in modern times people over 8 feet tall who, because they just don't stop growing like most of us do when we hit, adulthood, roughly. They just continue to grow. And a lot of times those people have health problems that prevent them from living a very long life. But hey, if Goliath were healthier, if he did not have some of the same problems some of those people do, he could very legitimately be over 9 feet tall and be an accomplished warrior. That's not something that stretches beyond belief by any stretch of the imagination. But I did want you to be aware of the manuscript difference there, that all of those manuscripts that we're talking about for both sides are highly respected, very standard manuscripts. This isn't, sometimes you can find, one fringe manuscript that says a strange thing. That's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with like the standard ones that do differ. So it is a bit of an oddity that we don't have a completely firm answer for. Okay, so the very tall man Goliath, the champion Goliath, has a helmet of bronze on his head. He's armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He has bronze armor on his legs, a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and a shield bearer went before him. I'm scared reading it. I don't want to see this champion. I don't want to go out into battle against him. He has large weapons, and he's a large man, and he goes and he shouts to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Why are you even here? What's the point of you coming out and trying to fight us?" He says, "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul?" And he makes that challenge, choose a man for yourselves to come and fight me. And then kind of digging the knife in, verse 10, he said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." So he is insulting them, defying them, very strongly opposing them and their king and their God. And it has the effect that the Philistines want, because when they hear the words of the Philistine, this includes Saul and all of Israel, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So, that's a problem, because nobody is eager to go out into battle. Anything else through verse 11? Okay, so now we're going to leave the field of battle for a moment. Oh yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Verse 11, see, the Israel army being led by fear, not inquiring of God. You see Saul's fear.
Yeah. They're led by fear. They're not trusting in God. They're thinking too much about, who among us would be able to fight against Goliath? Who among us would have the size and the skill and the ability to go and to defeat such a man in battle? They're embodying more and more of Saul's character. As Saul's character has fallen, Israel's has as well. Lots of problems here that are going to be exposed even more when David arrives on scene. What else? Yeah, Sue.
A little interesting that Jonathan hasn't stepped up.
Yes, also interesting. Not a lot of explanation for that here, but a notable absence, because Jonathan has gone against the character of his father and even the orders of his father in some previous occasions, that he has shown more faith and more courage. We don't know. We could speculate all day as to why Jonathan has not done this. He could be in fear with them. He could have been stopped by his father, said, "I'm not going to allow you to go." He, for some reason, may not be there at this battle, could be somewhere else. We simply don't know. This story is not about Jonathan, but yes, that is interesting that we don't see him stepping up. Anything else? Dave?
I see a significant parallel with Christ in this situation.
Yeah.
I don't mean to stretch, but Saul was probably the best guy physically to fight Goliath.
Yeah.
He's a big guy himself.
Mhm.
But since God left him in the spirit of distress, he's afraid, he's intimidated. That's what he can do. And I know his people must have expected him to step up.
Right.
He didn't do that. Well, with Christ, they also, the people, expected him to get rid of the Romans at first. That's what they thought.
Yeah.
And but Christ didn't come with intimidation.
Yeah.
He came with the truth, and he defeated sin that way.
Yeah.
So, but Saul's, I mean, what's going on here is, I just keep seeing the intimidation popping out.
Yeah.
People shirk back. You know, Christians need to have a strong spirit in the Lord. We need to be faithful. I'm not saying go out to fight a giant. I'm just saying that when that kind of stuff comes our way,
Yeah.
we've got to be like Christ, and we've got to fight the fight spiritually.
Yeah.
And we will win. It just like David usually
Yeah.
battle is won. So it's just a good example to me, anyways.
Yeah.
Of that. Is that the intimidation, we lose our faith, we lose our strength, we lose everything. We won't fight because we're afraid. And that's a bad thing to be in. Bad
Yeah.
situation to be in. So I see that for myself.
Yeah. We will be drawing more connections to how David is showing kind of shadows of Christ here. That's something that the workbook is asking us to do repeatedly in these lessons, because David is a shadow of Christ. He is the, Christ was said to sit on the throne of David, so kind of the continuation of the promise given to David's line. He's a part of David's lineage, physically speaking. And so, we're going to continue to look at those kinds of connections. But I strongly agree with the point here. This is what the people expect Saul to do. It is literally his purpose. They expect him to be the champion, to go and defeat Goliath. The text does not go through and say that specifically, because it already has. Like, that was the point of Saul being king. That they were happy to see him because he was a man of war. He was a man who looked like he could slay giants. He was a man who had the capabilities to go and defeat their enemies. So this was the whole reason why Israel wanted a king, to be able to repel the Philistines and whatever they threw their way, and somebody who is going to have the prowess to be successful. Saul is the promise for that as far as they're concerned, and he fails miserably here, because nothing about the victory that's going to happen here is by the hand of Saul. Not literally, and not even indirectly. Okay, yes. So, now we move on to David. We have rewound a little bit from what we saw last chapter. So now David is, this eighth son of Jesse. He has not yet proven himself in battle because he's not in the army. He's the shepherd. He's keeping his father's sheep. And at this point, Jesse is old and advanced in years, it says. So the three oldest sons are with Saul in battle. The other five are not. They're doing other things, whatever those other things are. We know what David was doing. He was keeping his father's sheep. And David's the youngest of the eight, as we mentioned before. So David has been going back and forth to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. He's taking care of them as he should. And we learn that what Goliath was doing in challenging Israel, he's doing this every day, morning and evening, for 40 days. So you've got the two armies camped on these opposing hillsides, these opposing mountainsides, and they are just waiting to see what's going to happen. And you can only imagine how morale is dropping in the Israelite camp. Because as each day goes by, it becomes abundantly clear that nobody is willing to go fight Goliath. Nobody is summoning up the courage to say, I will do it, I am capable of defeating him. And so they're all sitting there trying to decide, what's the next move? Saul has come up with no moves here. Just as wishy-washy and paranoid as he's been, he's not come up with any solution to defeat the Philistines or to do anything other than this uneasy stalemate of just sitting there with the challenge being offered day after day. So 40 days this has taken place. So Jesse tells David, his son, go take this gift of grain and loaves, go up to the army, check on your brothers, bring them some supplies, take these 10 cheeses to their commander as a gift as well. I love that as a gift, 10 cheeses to the commander. But really, what this is for David to find out how are his brothers doing. Jesse's concerned about his sons, of course, as anyone would be with their sons in battle, not able to really get an update on how things are going, knowing that there is a fierce enemy against them, and he wants an update. He's too old to go himself. David's going to do it. He's bringing these gifts so that he's not a bother, but is a welcome sight in the camp. So David rises early, and he left the sheep with some other keeper, took those provisions as Jesse commanded him, and when he gets to the camp, he sees Goliath offering he sees the host going out to the battle line shouting the war cry. So everyone's drawing up for a battle, but it's still that stalemate. So David leaves those gifts with the appropriate people. He's running to greet his brothers, and now this is when he sees Goliath coming up to the front line, offering that same challenge that he's offered for 40 days. But this time David has heard it. So this leads us to question number 3. Contrast the two ways of looking at Goliath in verses 25 and 26, or really this kind of whole section. What are different things said about Goliath by different people? Mark.
So when I was relying on himself, I was talking about Saul, he was taking over relying on himself, so we're inquiring of God.
Yeah.
And so they were fearful because they're looking to their own strength. You see David, who is full of the Spirit, that for several different reasons that have manifested in his own life, he has that great faith. And he is appalled at what he's seeing.
Yeah.
He's like, what's going on?
Yeah. So you're right. We've got one view that's very physically centered, very just centered on themselves, on saying, okay, this is a mighty champion. The king will enrich anyone who is mighty enough to overcome him. This is all about who among us would have the skill and the physical presence to be able to defeat Goliath. That's one level, the very practical, physical level. David is not looking at that. David doesn't look at Goliath and say, wow, he's a lot taller than I am. Or, wow, he has a lot more experience in war than I do. He's not saying any of that. He instead looks at this more from a spiritual perspective, a more of a zoomed out perspective, where he says that Goliath is this uncircumcised Philistine. that is defying not the armies of Saul. Note that's what the others were saying, but the king will enrich whoever is able to overcome him. David doesn't talk about the armies of Saul. He talks about the armies of God. That Goliath is defying God. So he's got this very different perspective that, as Mark said, leads him to be appalled at what Goliath is doing, appalled that he would defy and that nobody has stood up against him yet. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, it's a kind of, I don't think he meant it as a criticism against the men that were there. Here's this young lad.
Sure.
And he's really criticizing the fact that they have to go stay at this point. That's why his brother says what he said.
Right. Yeah, I don't, David is a lot more focused on like what Goliath is doing in defying God than he is in talking about the failure of the soldiers who are there. I don't even know that David knows that this has gone on for 40 days. He doesn't have any way of knowing that information. So as far as he's concerned, this is the first time Goliath has even come up. He doesn't really have reason to say that everyone else has failed. But implicitly, to those who do know that Goliath has been doing this for 40 days, David looks at this from a very different perspective than the rest of them are. So he implicitly is criticizing them, even without doing that directly, that they do not have this kind of faith. They do not see this as the spiritual struggle that it is. So yeah, that helps explain the brother's reaction that we'll get to here. But Eliab, his eldest brother, here's David's response. Here's David's assessment of the situation. And he's angry. I get it. The little brother, the baby brother has shown up, the youngest brother at that, the one who is not a soldier, mind you, does not have experience in battle. He doesn't know what it's like to be on these front lines. He doesn't know the rigors of war and how hard this is. And he shows up to presume he knows better. That's what Eliab says. He says, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness?" That's just a dig at David, that you aren't in charge of anything important. All you are is a shepherd, and not even that good of one, because you just watch over a few sheep in the wilderness. So you're small time. I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Accusing David of showing up, thinking he knows better, of insulting all of the soldiers who are there, and saying that he would be able to do better. And David more or less just kind of blows him off there, and says that that's not really his intent of, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? I'm not even really criticizing you, as was noted, more talking about this, foolish champion that has come up. And he just disengages from his brother, not even going to continue that conversation. He turned away from him and spoke toward another and spoke in the same way. But notice, it's not just Eliab who is responding to David in this way. The other soldiers are as well. They can only interpret David as being presumptuous and being the foolish young man who thinks he knows better. It's real easy to talk about how easy it would be to go and to fell Goliath when you're not on the front line, when you're not the one who's got to strap on the armor and take up the sword and go and fight against him. And while David was not the small child that sometimes he's made out to be in this, I'm not totally sure where that came from. We believe that he's, I don't know, you see like kids' Bible class stuff, David looks like he's 10 years old going out there against Goliath. I don't think he was 10 years old here, okay? He's not a little kid. He is a grown man, but the youngest of his brothers. And he's not a man of war. But he's also not really endearing himself to the soldiers who are there and thinking that he knows better. Okay?
Well, it seems to me like his brothers still don't appreciate the fact that he's been anointed.
Yeah, I wonder about that. And we're left with not as many details as I would like about what the family dynamics were in this. But you connect a few of these things here and you see that David to call him in when Samuel was there, when the holy man, the holy prophet has come. David, no, we don't need to worry about him. Leave him out there with the sheep. Here, Eliab seems to be pretty bitter towards him, and definitely denigrating what David's job is and role is in the family and in life. There does seem to be some bitterness. There's a lot of details missing. We just don't know all of how David was able to interact with his family, but there does seem to be some tension. Mark?
Well, I think the anointing would certainly indicate that he is being blessed by God.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that they were told that he would be the next king, or that he was expecting anything like that. When you go through the text, Samuel doesn't say, here's the new king. He doesn't say that.
Yeah.
He's not in the text. So all he knows at this point is that God has chosen him for a reason. What that reason is will reveal itself later. I don't know exactly. We don't know all the things that were said.
No, we don't.
I do find it amazing that these are his first words. And, he says within the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about his faith in God.
Right.
And that to me is like, wow, this had to be refreshing for these people.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a person who's pointing to God.
Yeah.
And it's his first words that he says among men.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not an accident. The author of Samuel here has definitely worked to show the difference between Samuel and Saul. The first thing we see, not Samuel and Saul, David and Saul, you know what I'm saying. The first words of David that we are given are words of faith, words that directly contradict the kind of man that Saul was. So yeah, while we might be interested to know some more of the stories of what were his brothers doing and what were the relationships there, what was Jonathan doing at this point, this is about David, not about any of them. So he has more faith than the rest of these men, and even these soldiers who are there, and they can only understand David's statements as being presumptuous because they're still seeing this in the small lens of who could be mighty enough to overcome Goliath. And yeah, I agree with you that I'm not sure that David or the brothers were told directly that David was going to be the next king. The anointing was not a coronation, that we know for sure. It was an expression of God being with David and that he was going to bless him and was making some kind of promise to David. But Samuel does not come right out and say it's possible that they knew, because we don't know everything that was said. It's possible that they didn't. But either way, there's opportunity for bitterness and jealousy. Because even just the holy man, the holy prophet coming, and he's going to anoint the baby brother? Are you serious? Yeah. Alan?
I prefer to look at it from a perspective of God preparing him for the job ahead.
Definitely.
And if you kind of look at it like that, a lot of the scripture makes more sense from a perspective that whether he knew or not, it really doesn't matter. What matters is he grew into that role.
Yeah.
And along that way, as he grew into that role, he never abandoned his faith in God.
Right.
And that was his strength. And even though he
sure. And that's definitely the focus here. You see God moving the pieces into place, getting David into the king's court. He's got to learn how to be king. How do you take a young shepherd and one day just say, you're king now? Being king is not easy. There's responsibility there that he's got to learn how this works. Being in the king's court is going to help him to see what that job looks like, even if Saul's example may be negative in a lot of cases. His faith is going to continue to grow. The courage of being able to overcome Goliath here, lots of different things will grow as God is preparing him. Whether David knows specifically at this point what he's being prepared for is immaterial, because he is one way or another being prepared, and this is God's will that David becomes the next king. Question number, oh yeah, Maria, please.
I think also going back a little bit further, that David, Saul, who was good looking, he was tall,
Yeah.
strong. The people wanted a king, right? And they wanted something like that. And with David, he's small, he's young, he's
Yeah.
his heart is there. Saul.
Yeah.
God talked about in the passage in 16, verse 7, how his heart,
Yeah.
David's heart. Then God was trying to show, to prove to the Israelites, it's not the strength of what's on the outside of the man, the
Yeah.
strength that the person has, it's the heart has.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, your champion of a king who's head and shoulders above everyone, who is good looking and everything that you thought the perfect king would be. What's he doing for you right now? Is he defeating the Philistines? Even when they did defeat the Philistines before, it was Jonathan more than Saul who did it. Is he doing anything now? Is he going out into battle? Is he showing faith? Is he encouraging the people to rely on God? He's not doing any of that. It's David who seems the unlikely hero, the one who does not look like he should be able to do this, but has the heart of a man who trusts in God.
Well, since they were trusting in themselves instead of in God, they could have been more reluctant, because Saul's challenge, or not Saul's challenge, Goliath's challenge was, you send your champion out, and I'll fight, and whoever wins is the victor, and the others will be the servants.
Yeah.
So, if they're trusting in themselves, it's like, okay, well, if I lose, all my brethren are going to be also, subject now to the Philistines.
Yeah.
So that's a heavy, if they're trusting in themselves.
Yeah.
That's a heavy burden for themselves.
Absolutely. Would you look at yourself and say, yes, out of everybody here, I am the one who should go and do this? Like, if you're trusting in yourself, like it's easy to say, well, he's better with the sword than I am, or he's taller, he's stronger, he's the king, there's all sorts of different things you can say. Steve, you had your hand up. No?
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you said unlikely hero, that kind of reminded me of unlikely hero to be the king. Also, Isaiah 53, Jesus is an unlikely hero.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of connections here between David and Jesus. And we'll talk more about that next week, because we'll do questions 4 and 5. What gave David confidence he could destroy Goliath? Talk about how he actually killed Goliath. And then more of his parallels that we were talking about last week as well. Thank you.